She walked a path she knew better than her own heartbeat, and never made the turn home. Her fitness tracker recorded a perfect mile, then froze forever. No struggle, no witnesses, no trace. Now investigators fear she wasn't the first, and the routine you trust most might be the one someone is already studying in silence. She was the type of person whose absence would immediately feel wrong. 33 years old, disciplined and organized, she worked in data management at a local tech office, a job that demanded accuracy and rewarded structure. She lived alone, but she was never disconnected. Her sister Emma checked in daily. Co-workers often joked that Avery's calendar controlled her life more than she did, and her health app was filled with months of detailed metrics. Everything about her suggested constancy, not disappearance. She was exactly the kind of woman who didn't just wander off into mystery, which is why, when she did, the entire community would struggle to accept it. Her neighborhood trail wasn't deep into wilderness or lined with dangerous terrain. It was a familiar suburban nature path circling the edge of Westwater Creek, popular with dog owners, retirees, and morning runners. Most people could walk it half awake without a second thought. It wasn't the kind of place that demanded vigilance, at least not until Avery walked it on that particular morning. She wore black leggings, a lightweight gray jacket, and her running shoes, gear chosen for comfort rather than survival. A single earbud tucked into one ear played a playlist she preferred for keeping pace. She carried only her phone and a small water bottle clipped to her waistband. Nothing about her indicated she expected anything out of the ordinary. At the start of the trail, her tracker captured the date and the time, Chi, RAM. Sensors synced with her phone, verifying speed, distance, and heart rhythm. The numbers rolled forward the way they always did as she moved steadily along the familiar path. Her steps were sure, relaxed, and perfectly timed. The data later revealed she didn't stop for anything. Not to check messages, not to take a breath, not to tighten a shoelace. There was no deviation, no hesitation. This walk was routine, and routine was supposed to be safe. But at exactly Chi Sherbad AM, Eating Lingling mile deeper trail, Kumpur AM, Eaton Lingling mile deep into the trail, her step counter registered a final stride. And then absolute stillness, no gradual slowdown, no stumble recorded in movement patterns. Her heart rate data didn't spike or drop. It simply stopped tracking forward. The digital world, which had always shadowed every detail of her life, suddenly fell silent. It was as though someone hit a master switch that froze her in place, severing the connection between the data and the person generating it. Wonk. What investigators would find later only deepened the confusion. Her water bottle was upright beside the trail, not fallen or scuffed. Her phone lay neatly against a bed of leaves, screen face up with no cracks or smudges that suggested haste or panic. The earbud still played music, low but active, until its battery eventually drained. Nothing seemed abandoned. Instead, everything looked deliberately arranged, the way Avery might set down items on her desk before stepping into another room. Except she had not stepped into another room. She had stepped out of the world. The surrounding soil revealed almost nothing. A partial imprint of her shoe pointed slightly off the path, but no series of prints continued from it. There were no signs of dragging, no upturned earth showing resistance, no branches snapped in flight. It was as though she had followed some invisible cue that led her away from the trail and then ceased to exist. Later, detectives would say the scene felt artificially clean, like someone had scrubbed away any trace of confusion, leaving only the illusion of calm. The absence of chaos became its own kind of chaos. Hours passed before anyone noticed she hadn't returned home. A missed call from her boss, a text from Emma left unanswered, the slow erosion of excuses family members make for delays. These little alarms gathered weight until worry hardened into fear. By evening, police were searching the trail with flashlights and calling her name into the darkening woods, trying to understand how a walk that required no courage ended in a mystery that demanded explanation. The search dogs pulled confidently along the trail for a while, but near the 1-mile mark, they became disoriented. They circled, whined, and then stopped just as the data had. worn. It was as if everything connected to Avery, her body, her signal, her scent, hit the same invisible wall. Care. Friends insisted she wouldn't leave her things behind knowingly. Her sister clung to the unshakable belief that Avery would never step off that path for a stranger or a distraction. But the evidence suggested she had done exactly that. She had veered a few inches into uncertainty and vanished between one heartbeat and the next. Even the detectives who would later lead the investigation admitted the case challenged logic more than any they had previously worked. Disappearances typically left at least a thread to pull, a direction of footprints, a witness, a disturbance. Here, the trail simply ended. No path forward, no path back, just a perfect mile mathematically flawless and narratively wrong. The numbers told a story no one understood. Avery walked our steps and then stopped forever. Standing at the point where her data froze, officers marked the area with a small orange flag, a symbol for the precise location where her presence in the world could be proven. They often returned to this spot in the weeks that followed, pacing the curve of the path, trying to imagine what she saw in the last moment that she continued to exist as someone trackable and known. The deeper they searched for meaning in that frozen step, the more one unsettling truth became clear. Avery had not simply, she had been interrupted. Later that night, when detectives reviewed the final steps on her digital trail, they uncovered one impossible detail. The exact angle of her last stride indicated she wasn't stepping back toward home, but toward something waiting in the trees. Avery Cole's life was defined by predictable patterns, the sort of daily structure that people admire for its discipline without recognizing how quickly routine can turn into vulnerability. She grew up in the Midwest, moved to Westwater for a stable job offer, and built a quiet but fulfilling life in a 2-bedroom townhome near the trail she loved so much. Every morning played out like a sequence she had rehearsed thousands of times. She woke before sunrise, brewed the same dark roast coffee, skimmed the news headlines, and stepped out the door by 7 o'clock sharp. There was comfort in that rhythm, a certainty that the world she understood would remain steady beneath her feet. What no one ever realized was that her dependability, so admired by others, also made her the easiest person in the world to predict. Avery's co-workers described her as the anchor of their department. She worked in data analysis, a role where precision and reliability weren't merely assets, they were requirements. She thrived under that pressure. Her projects were completed early, her reports flawless, her workflow meticulous enough to make supervisors forget problems ever existed. If she said she would deliver something by noon, she did so at 11. If she said she would text her sister after her morning walk, she always did. When she didn't, it was the kind of anomaly that signaled alarm long before official concern was raised. Despite her reserved nature, she was deeply connected to the people in her life. Her sister Emma lived 2 towns over, and the two of them shared a bond strengthened after their mother passed unexpectedly 8 years earlier. They relied on each other for emotional navigation, the small, steady check-ins that form the heartbeat of family. Avery's closest friend from work, a cheerful colleague named Hannah, often urged her to branch out socially, to break from habit once in a while. Avery usually smiled politely, promising maybe next week. Next week rarely came. She didn't consider herself lonely, just content with simplicity. That contentment was precisely why her disappearance struck everyone as profoundly wrong. People who vanish are usually running from chaos. Avery lived in calm. Her digital life echoed the same order. Her fitness apps showed unbroken streaks of activity. Her sleep tracker charted a reliable 7 hours each night. Her grocery receipts rotated between identical shopping lists. Her presence in the world was consistent, measurable, and normal. Investigators later remarked that she was the kind of person whose last movements should have been the easiest to trace. Yet reality proved the opposite. Every record shouted stability until the exact second it fell silent, leaving a void too abrupt to feel natural. Avery's personality added to the confusion. She was not impulsive. She did not chase curiosity down risky paths. The walking trail she chose every morning wasn't merely preferred. It was the only one she used. Even the distance was standardized: 2 miles, never more, never less. 1 mile out, 1 mile back. A perfect loop she completed before most neighbors turned on their porch lights. She didn't wander or pause to explore. She didn't leave the path for photographs or investigate unusual sounds. Her careful nature was almost a guarantee. She wasn't the type to willingly step into the unknown. The days before her disappearance gave authorities nothing to grasp. Her work reports remained on schedule. Her bank statements showed steady habits without surprises. Security footage captured her returning home each evening with grocery bags or takeout, never accompanied by anyone. Her text messages with Emma were about mundane things: weekend plans, a new movie recommendation, reminders to bring a dessert to their cousin's baby shower. There were no arguments, no hints of anxiety, no sudden purchases or alarming internet searches. Her life before she vanished was a portrait of someone moving peacefully toward the future, not folding into crisis. Her coworkers felt the absence instantly. When she didn't clock into work that morning, a chain of automated alerts eventually flagged her as missing. But it was Emma's frantic worry that ignited the search in earnest. She called the police before lunchtime, her voice tight with the kind of fear only someone who knows a person intimately can feel. She told them Avery would never walk off the grid intentionally. She insisted something was wrong. Police at first combed through the usual theories: miscommunication, voluntary separation, an impulsive detour. None of those fit. Avery was the kind of person who triple-checked her plans and confirmed safety before considering adventure. Investigators soon learned that Avery's predictable nature introduced a darker possibility. Predictability works for someone watching. Her routine wasn't a secret. Everyone in her neighborhood knew she walked that trail every morning at about the same time. Anyone observing even casually could have tracked her pattern in a matter of days, timing her exact route, identifying when she reached each segment of the trail, learning that she kept one earbud free to remain aware of her surroundings. Her caution may have been strong, but her schedule was stronger. In the wrong hands, her reliability transformed from safety into target. What rattled investigators most was her step count data. She didn't slow down before vanishing. Her stride remained even and unbroken until the moment the tracker registered the 1 mile mark. And then the information stopped, as though someone had removed Avery from the world with surgical precision. If she were simply tired, distressed, or distracted, the data would reflect a hesitation, a pause, an interruption in movement. Instead, it showed that Avery was living her ordinary life 1 second, and then, in the next, she was gone. There was no digital breadcrumb left behind, no scattered evidence to build a narrative around. Her routine ended cleanly, unnervingly, in a place that should have been protected by familiarity. Friends formed theories to fill the silence. Perhaps she encountered someone she knew. Perhaps she saw something that caught her attention. Perhaps the urge to help someone forced her off the path. But each idea collapsed under the same weight. Avery never stepped off routine without telling someone. Her world operated on accountability, and this moment had none. Authorities eventually accepted what her family already knew. Avery didn't choose to vanish. Something intervened. Her unwavering routine was shattered by a single deviation. And within that deviation lived the truth investigators would spend months trying to uncover or care. If Avery's life was predictable down to the minute, then someone else must have known exactly when she would reach that 1 mile mark, and that knowledge was enough to erase her without leaving a trace. The Westwater Creek Nature Trail had never been the kind of place that bred fear. On any given morning, the path wound through gentle scenery, soft earth covered in damp leaves, tall grasses brushing against low fences, and a steady chorus of birds establishing territory in the canopies above. It was a trail built for comfort, knowingly designed to give the illusion of wild serenity while still maintaining the safety of civilization. Local families used it for weekend picnics. Teenagers jogged its curves before school. Retirees walked dogs that sniffed happily along the edges without ever finding anything more threatening than a rabbit. The environment existed as a reliable contrast to the rest of the world's instability. Here, people trusted nature because they believed nature trusted them back. Avery knew every inch of that trail. She could predict the moment the morning light would break through the cottonwoods and hit the path at a soft angle. She knew where the creek narrowed into a whisper and where it widened into a slow-moving pool that mirrored the sky. She recognized the slight elevation change underfoot just before the wooden footbridge and the familiar crunch of gravel once she crossed it. She could walk the loop with her eyes half shut and still maintain stride, her senses sharpening out of habit more than necessity. The trail represented consistency, a familiar world she could count on when everything else demanded her attention. It was her sanctuary, but familiarity can disguise danger more efficiently than fear ever could. Paths like these make people believe they are safe simply because they have never been unsafe before. The community had grown complacent, convinced that the presence of others ensured protection. People rarely looked behind them. They rarely questioned another set of footsteps. They didn't hesitate to share their routes online or leave recurring patterns for anyone observing. It was precisely that comfort that cast the first shadow across Avery's disappearance. When investigators surveyed the trail after she vanished, they documented a timeline that felt almost too normal. A few minutes before Avery reached the 1-mile point, a cyclist passed through, remembering nothing out of place. A couple walking their golden retriever followed far behind her, never catching up. Another runner began the loop later and crossed the same area 20 minutes afterward, unaware anything had happened. Dozens of people moved along the trail that morning, and yet the only person no one saw again was Avery. The section where her data froze appeared unremarkable. A slight incline, a bend that obscured the view just enough, a cluster of young pines pushing in from one side like curious onlookers. It was neither hidden nor exposed, neither isolated nor it sat at a transitional point where the trail shifted from bright openness near the creek to a corridor of filtered light through the trees. Investigators suspected that if someone wanted to intercept a target without drawing attention, this was the place they would choose. Just enough privacy to act unnoticed, just enough foot traffic to justify their presence. As search teams marked the ground with fluorescent flags, they took note of everything that didn't belong. Small peculiarities emerged, not significant enough to draw immediate conclusions, but too aligned to be ignored. There was a patch of flattened grass a few feet off the trail, shaped like a person had stood there for several minutes. A discarded wrapper recently dropped that no one could confirm belonged to Avery. A track in the dirt that matched no shoe in her closet. Transforming the familiar into a scene of concern required just a few small differences, and this place offered them all with eerie subtlety. Questions began to surface that no one could easily answer. If Avery veered off the path, what compelled her to do so? There were no animals spotted by nearby hikers, no lost children or urgent distractions. The trail was quiet, the kind of quiet that would normally feel peaceful, but now felt like a silence built to hide something. The absence of sound became suspicious in hindsight. A breeze should have moved through the trees, leaves rustling in their typical morning rhythm. But in the minutes investigators tried to reconstruct, there was no echo of panic, no crack in the silence indicating a struggle. The environment offered nothing. That silence became the loudest part of the case. Technology provided few answers. Mapping software displayed a perfect, unwavering trajectory up to the moment the step counter stopped. The path ahead should have shown a continuation of movement. 2 more steps, 5 more, 20 more, but there was nothing. The virtual trail ended in a dead pixel. The digital certainty Avery built her life around failed her at the exact moment she needed it most. The disappearance grew stranger as specialists analyzed signal patterns and determined that the final location where the data froze wasn't just a random place in the trail. It was a blind spot in the area's wireless coverage, one that someone who studied the terrain would have known existed. When the sun dipped below the trees that evening, officers lingered longer than necessary at the 1-mile mark. They stood still as Avery must have, trying to feel the weight of that moment. They imagined what she might have seen when she paused, if she paused at all. They tried to sense what she might have sensed, whether her instincts warned her before her world shifted. Her nature was cautious, so the idea that she stepped willingly toward danger unsettled them. She was not reckless. She wasn't easily distracted. She was a woman who respected boundaries and didn't stray from them without cause. If she left the safety of the trail, then the reason had to be compelling. And whatever that reason was, it still remained hidden within the trees, beyond the point where ordinary life ended. Corinna, the trail that had always given people peace, suddenly felt predatory. What had once been a friendly escape now resembled a trap set with quiet precision. The familiarity of the path was an illusion. It had been studied, timed, understood by someone who recognized how vulnerability hides behind routine. Avery Cole didn't vanish because she trusted the wrong place. She vanished because she trusted the right place too completely. And as investigators prepared to leave for the night, one officer noticed something half buried near the trunks of the pines. A partial footprint facing the woods, aligned perfectly with Avery's final step, as if someone had been waiting for her to arrive. The digital world had always been a reliable witness in Avery Cole's life. It documented her every move, tracked her progress, rewarded her consistency, and stored a record of habits she rarely thought twice about. Her phone and smartwatch didn't merely support her routine. They defined it. That technology was supposed to provide reassurance, a sense that even if she walked alone, she was never truly unseen. Yet when investigators studied the data from the morning she vanished, that same technology delivered a message that chilled them more than the absence of evidence ever could. Avery did not fade away. She stopped instantly, and something else happened immediately after. The analysis began with the most straightforward information, the step counter. It showed a perfectly measured mile, logged over 16 minutes of steady movement. She maintained her usual pace the entire time. No sprint, no pause, no stumble. Her stride pattern indicated a calm walk, body balanced, breathing regulated. Then, at Chi Shirbad Arshashti AM, her movement data ended abruptly. Investigators initially assumed a device error, trackers glitch, signals drop, batteries fail, but none of those explanations held up under inspection. The battery still had more than half its charge. The sensor logs showed no disruption. The watch remained connected to the phone even after the steps stopped. The silence in the data wasn't a malfunction. It was a precise moment when the device stopped registering motion because Avery herself had stopped making it. Her heart rate metrics deepened the mystery. They showed no panic, no adrenaline spike, no sudden drop-off indicating collapse. Instead, her pulse remained comfortably steady until the moment her physical activity ceased. For 14 more minutes after that, the device continued sending normal readings. Oxygen saturation stable, skin temperature unchanged, suggesting that Avery was not only alive but stationary. If she had fainted or been rendered unconscious, her vitals would have reflected a dramatic shift. If she had willingly rested, she would have resumed movement shortly after. The data implied something else entirely. She was upright, immobilized, and unable to take a single step. Investigators considered the possibility that she stopped voluntarily, drawn by something off the trail. But then why did she not move again? And why would she set her belongings down in an arrangement that looked so controlled? Nothing about the evidence suggested panic or distraction. There was no indication of discomfort or sudden injury. Even her breathing pattern remained calm for several minutes following the step freeze. Danger was present. Her body did not react to it, at least not in a way the device could measure. Forensics experts pieced together what remained of her digital signature. A geolocation pinpointed her final position with startling accuracy. A cluster of coordinates marking a spot that investigators returned to repeatedly, unable to understand why nothing more existed beyond that point. The officers on site knew the exact patch of ground where Avery stood alive, heart beating within cell signal range, and then, the next moment she was gone, not merely missing, removed from the map. The data timeline suggested a disturbing sequence. Avery stopped walking, remained still, and then her devices went out of range. Out of range did not mean out of battery. It meant movement movement to a location her phone could no longer reach, a tower. If she had wandered deeper into the woods, her steps would have registered until the trees intercepted the signal. But instead, the tracker jumped from on-trail to offline without a single trace of movement connecting those two states. There was no gradual fade in signal strength, no transitional coordinates, no digital footprint explaining the gap. The leap could only suggest one terrifying explanation: Avery was transported. Detectives began consulting specialists who understood just how precise location tracking had become. They asked if a person could be carried, dragged, or forced away while remaining physically still enough for the watch to record no change in cadence. The scenario required a method of removal that avoided contact with the wrist, created no sudden tension, and caused no spike in pulse. It wasn't impossible. But it wasn't likely unless the movement was immediate, or four-sporamere, controlled and executed by someone who knew how to minimize human reaction. The more investigators studied the silent moments after the step counter stopped, the more the case took on a sinister shape. There was no resistance recorded, no fear, no warning. It was as if something or someone appeared behind her, intercepting her reality before she had time to recognize the threat. The absence of struggle didn't comfort anyone. Instead, it raised the possibility that Avery never understood danger was present. If she didn't experience fear, she couldn't respond to it, and that level of manipulation suggested expertise. One analyst reviewing the data late at night made an observation that would send the case spiraling into deeper speculation. Avery's heart rate maintained a calm rhythm, not just because she failed to react, but because whatever happened to her didn't require physical exertion. It required submission, not necessarily willing but instant. The analyst wrote a single note that would later become central to the FBI's profile: "Der Frickes Trang." Subject may have been immobilized before fear response initiated. Law enforcement could no longer rely on accident theories. They expanded the case, pulling footage from nearby roads, analyzing traffic records, and interviewing anyone who may have been in the area around the time her phone lost signal. One troubling detail emerged at 10 a.m., approximately 15 minutes after her step data stopped. The network received a brief signal ping from Avery's phone, farther north than her known position. It disappeared again seconds later, like a mistake in the system, or a clue someone didn't fully erase. Search teams scoured that secondary area, a region with minimal public access and no official trail crossings. They found tire tracks leading in and out of a service road that maintenance crews rarely used. The marks were too fresh to ignore. It was a road designed to conceal movement, a perfect exit path from the trail without being seen. The digital trail didn't end because the devices failed. It ended because something intervened with cold precision. Technology told the story: an abrupt stop, a period of forced stillness, and then a sudden removal from the grid. Avery didn't vanish into the woods. She was taken out of them. Investigators traced the final ping to a spot just beyond the service road, a patch of cleared ground where they uncovered one chilling piece of evidence. Another missing woman's tracker had frozen in the exact same way, only months before Avery ever walked that path. The Westwater Creek Trail had always been alive with people during early hours, a comforting rhythm of footsteps and casual greetings passing through the cool morning air. On the day Avery vanished, it was no different. Joggers kept pace with their breathing, dogs tugged their leashes toward familiar smells, and cyclists coasted along the asphalt entryway before transitioning to the packed dirt path. A community moved around her, close enough to notice if something had gone wrong, or so everyone believed. Yet, in a moment that determined the rest of her story, no one witnessed Avery leave the world she knew behind. Investigators reconstructed the positions of every person recorded entering the park. That morning, a young woman pushing a stroller left 10 minutes before Avery arrived. A retiree walked his terrier ahead of her for part of the route before turning on to the shorter loop. A cyclist shot past her early in the walk, music blasting too loudly to hear anything else. Two high school friends jogged the outer trail, laughing so loudly they barely noticed the creak. They say all recalled a normal morning, none recalled Avery after the 1-mile mark. The trail was full. But the moment she disappeared was empty. Routine can dull awareness. It encourages assumptions that familiar objects remain familiar, that people around us continue to be people we can see. The few who crossed Avery's path that morning later described her with certainty, focused, calm, maintaining her rhythm. Then they described everything else around her with casual dismissiveness. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing stood out. The mind filters what it expects to find, and nothing about Avery's presence suggested danger. That was the comfort of routine and the trap. Police took statements repeatedly, hoping details would surface through repetition. Did anyone notice a vehicle parked near the service road entrance? Did anyone see a person who did not belong? Did anyone hear a sudden shift in the sounds of the forest? An interruption, a silence too sharp to be coincidence? Each answer was the same: no. The trail was peaceful. There were birds. There was the creek. There was the light breeze rustling leaves. No alarm, no tension, no scream. But one detail remained haunting. Nearly every witness mentioned something that seemed irrelevant initially. They remembered looking ahead. Their focus always pointed forward. Joggers kept eyes on the curve of the path. Walkers gazed into the direction they were moving. Even dogs charged forward, excited by the promise of distance. No one had looked backward. No one had paid attention to who might have been behind them, behind Avery. People rarely do. Our eyes are trained to chase progress, not protect the past. This blind spot became a working theory among investigators. If someone had been trailing Avery, waiting for the moment she reached that precise location, they could have acted without being seen by a single person. A predator using silence and timing instead of force would leave behind nothing more than absence. And absence often goes unnoticed until too much time has passed. Psychologists consulting on the case offered their own disturbing perspective. Humans are terrible witnesses to routine. When nothing seems out of order, the brain files everything under safe, even when danger passes a few feet away. A woman disappearing in a populated place sounded impossible. In reality, it was the easiest environment for a quiet abduction. Crowds expect obvious disruptions. They do not register the quiet ones. And still, there was one person who broke from the chorus of certainty. A jogger named Michelle, who usually arrived on the trail later than Avery, told detectives she saw something that morning. Or rather, someone. A figure near the bend where Avery vanished. She couldn't describe the person. She insisted she hadn't really registered what she saw. Just a shape, still and dark, standing off the path in the line of trees. Not moving. Not observing her. Almost blending into the scenery. She didn't look at them long enough to gather detail, dismissing the presence as another early walker catching their breath. Oh, it was only after news of Avery's disappearance spread that the memory returned, sharp enough to unsettle her. She cried as she recounted it, frustrated her attention had not lingered longer. She replayed the moment in her mind, the flash of dark clothing against the backdrop of pines, pinning, the stillness that seemed unnatural in hindsight. She couldn't recall a face, couldn't swear if it was a man or woman, but she knew one thing clearly: the person hadn't belonged there. Not in the way everyone else that morning did. They didn't move, they didn't turn. They simply existed in a place where no one ever stood still. Investigators returned to that detail repeatedly. A still figure at the exact location where Avery's movement ceased. A motionless presence in a place designed for motion. The contrast felt deliberate. The lack of reaction from others proved effectiveness. Whoever orchestrated Avery's disappearance understood the psychology of invisibility. People ignore what doesn't move. They identify dangers by chaos, not quiet. The absence of witnesses wasn't a flaw in the investigation, it was evidence in itself. It suggested planning, observation, familiarity with the trail's rhythm. Someone had studied the crowds long enough to know when the path would be momentarily isolated, when Avery would reach that 1-mile mark, when no one's gaze would turn back to notice a disappearance executed in absolute silence. Whoa. Hat. Full Tinder. As the hours after Avery's disappearance became days and then weeks, the community's fear grew sharper. Parents stopped allowing their children to walk the trail alone. Runners changed routes. The once bustling path emptied, each remaining visitor glancing over their shoulder more often than forward. The trail had not changed its shape or its scenery, but it no longer offered peace. Even casual pedestrians felt the shift. Trust in a familiar place had been broken. Where Avery once found comfort, others now found warning. Avery Cole didn't vanish into a void. She vanished into a crowd that had never learned to identify a predator who worked without sound. Weeks later, investigators uncovered a security camera from a nearby parking lot and found footage of someone leaving the trail just minutes after Avery disappeared, walking calmly, wearing a hood pulled low, and carrying something small and metallic in their hand. The first evidence collected along the trail hinted at a disappearance that had been orchestrated with precision. Everything Avery left behind contradicted the idea of panic. Her phone was discovered with its screen still active, resting gently against a patch of fallen leaves, displaying her step count as if waiting for the next number. Her earbuds, still paired, played the faint rhythm of her morning playlist. Her water bottle stood upright nearby, not knocked over or dirt-streaked, but placed, positioned, as if someone wanted it to be found. It was the stillness of these objects that made investigators uneasy. They expected chaos, a trace of struggle, a clue delivered through force. Instead, the scene looked curated. When forensic teams examined the items, they found no fingerprints that shouldn't have been there. The phone carried only Avery's touch. The bottles showed no grip marks indicating sudden removal. Nothing revealed the presence of another person. It was an absence too perfect for comfort. Even the ground beneath the objects showed almost no impressions beyond what Avery might have made herself. The soil wasn't disturbed by frantic movement or heavy weight. It told a quiet story, a story that made no sense. Then came the footprints. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about the shallow imprints in the dirt. The familiar tread of Avery's running shoes, positioned as though she simply stopped to catch her breath. But as investigators followed the line of prints leading to the 1-mile mark, they discovered overlap. Subtle, calculated overlap. Another set of impressions appeared faintly beneath hers, as if someone had stepped exactly where she stepped, matching her pace and rhythm, erasing their existence by folding it into hers. The prints were narrower, the sole pattern older, flat, lacking modern traction design. A shoe style not common today. It suggested someone had been close, too close. Balyan. The discovery of these hidden tracks changed the direction of the investigation. If someone had walked directly behind Abe, they could have stayed completely obscured from the view of anyone ahead of her. A person shadowing her so precisely would have known her stride length, pace, and timing. They would have studied her routine until it became a script they could follow without hesitation. It wasn't just abduction, it was choreography. Technicians analyzing Avery's smartwatch pinged on one disturbing detail, signs of slight pressure on the band, not enough to indicate a grab or pull, but enough to suggest contact. A brief shift in wrist alignment, barely there, occurring seconds before the step count stopped. It was a clue so delicate that it raised more questions than answers. Did someone touch her without alarming her? Did she turn instinctively, believing she recognized whoever approached? Or was she immobilized before she could acknowledge danger? As in Tornsak, they found a fabric thread near the trail, a piece too small to identify with the naked eye. Under laboratory examination, the thread revealed a synthetic blend not found in Avery's clothing. The fibers were rugged, industrial, and resistant to environmental wear. They belonged to a material used in specialized jackets, older models often worn by utility workers, or, as a retired ranger later suggested, by those familiar with outdoor enforcement roles decades earlier. It was an artifact of a different era, inexplicably present in a disappearance defined by modern data. Cow, the trail itself resisted giving up secrets. Cadaver dogs, usually reliable in tracking human scent, lost Avery's trail sharply at the slope just beyond her final step. They wandered in distressed circles, confused by the sudden evaporation of her presence. Search and rescue teams theorized that if Avery was lifted swiftly off the ground, her scent path would break instantly. But for that to occur so cleanly required timing, strength, and planning. Whoever intercepted Avery had not acted on impulse. Near the service road, investigators discovered deeper tire impressions, fresh, patterned, and oddly angled as if a vehicle reversed into the area rather than driving through. The tracks suggested a quick entry, a stop, and an exit along a route hidden from public view. But the most troubling detail wasn't the direction of the tracks, it was their width. The tires matched a model used rarely in personal vehicles, but commonly in older government-issued utility trucks. The thought that someone with institutional knowledge of the forest roads could have been involved moved the investigation into darker territory. Inside the command center, detectives replayed the trail timeline repeatedly. Each time they reached the missing moment, the recordings fell silent. Technology, the constant witness, had run out of words. The case demanded answers, yet every clue acted like a locked door. Each one pointed toward intelligence, capability, and awareness of how investigations work, how to avoid cameras, how to mask motion, how to choose a location with a minimal footprint. The discovery of the masked shoe prints became the turning point. It confirmed that someone had been behind Avery, close enough to mimic her step for step, hidden within the familiarity of the routine she trusted. And if they could follow her without detection, then this might not have been the first time. The deeper investigators delved into Avery's life and surroundings, the more one unsettling truth hardened into suspicion. It wasn't just disappearance. It was expertise, a method, a pattern waiting to be uncovered. People began whispering fears they were once too rational to entertain. Maybe Avery wasn't the only one. Maybe Westwater Creek wasn't a sanctuary. Maybe routine was merely bait for someone who watched the path every morning, waiting for another opportunity that would appear as ordinary as a perfect mile. The case file grew thicker, but the story remained painfully thin. Evidence existed, but it refused to speak plainly. Every detail was a whisper, every clue a half-truth. The more investigators collected, the clearer the silence became. Someone had transformed familiarity into a weapon. Avery's trail didn't point inward. It pointed directly to a shadow that had walked with her, unseen, until the moment she stopped existing in the world everyone else recognized. Under magnification, the overlapping shoe prints revealed a chilling detail. A tiny inscription on the faint, older sole pattern, initials worn into the rubber that matched those of another person, who had vanished on the same trail 3 years earlier. Search teams covered the Westwater Creek Trail with a level of urgency usually reserved for accidents involving loud distress or visible danger. But Avery Cole's disappearance offered none of those indicators. There was no scream to trace, no fallen branch signaling a chase, no scattered items that pointed toward flight. The people searching for her weren't following chaos. They were following a silence so complete it felt calculated. The trail had swallowed Avery, and the investigators had to learn how to search for the absence of a person rather than the presence of one. By midday on the day she vanished, the first phase of the search was already underway. Officers combed the path in slow, sweeping motions, stopping to mark anything that could be interpreted as a clue, though nearly everything they found lacked context. The trail, once a quiet haven, became a grid of fluorescent flags and boot prints. Drone teams flew thermal imaging devices over the forest canopy, scanning for heat signatures that might indicate a person in distress. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. The forest was quiet, still, and uncooperative. As night approached and temperatures dropped, search crews widened their perimeter. They combed ravines, tested soil near the creek bed, and searched shallow, off-trail clearings. Flashlights sliced through the darkness, hoping to catch the reflection of a phone screen or the glint of a reflective jacket. They expected at least a trace, bent grass, a shoe print, anything, but every terrain check repeated the same story. Avery walked 1 mile into her routine and simply stopped existing along the ground. Reading. Tracking dogs brought in from 2 counties followed Avery's scent flawlessly along the route until they reached the point where her step data froze. There the dogs hesitated, they circled, they whined, and then they stopped altogether, noses lifted to the air as if scent no longer rested on the earth. Trainers reported the same result again and again. The scent detached from the ground and drifted upward, a signal consistent with someone being lifted vertically or placed into a vehicle that never touched the trail. Wow, the strange tire tracks discovered near the old service road fueled suspicion. Their depth suggested weight, their direction suggested secrecy. They did not follow the normal flow of park maintenance vehicles, which typically entered during daylight hours with clear objectives. Instead, the tracks arrived and departed at times no one could account for. The presence of heavy tread patterns raised more questions. Who was driving such a vehicle? And why had no one noticed it entering the area? The FBI was called in by the end of the first week, not because evidence demanded federal involvement, but because fear did. Avery was not the kind of woman whose disappearance could be attributed to personal crisis. She was stable, grounded, and rooted in a life she valued. Cases like hers rarely end quietly and almost never resolve themselves. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit reviewed every detail of her routine, emphasizing one uncomfortable truth: predictability invites surveillance. Whoever took Avery knew the route, knew the timing, and knew the blind spots better than she did. Investigators interviewed residents living near the trail entrance. One homeowner mentioned hearing the distant rumble of an engine earlier than usual that morning, but discounted it at the time because early work trucks frequently passed through. Another neighbor recalled seeing a flashlight beam moving behind the tree line 2 nights before Avery vanished, but assumed it belonged to a lost hiker. Each memory seemed harmless in isolation. Woven together, they formed a pattern of preparation. Searchers continued returning to the 1 mile mark, the last location where Avery's existence intersected with certainty. Officers stood in stillness at the dip in the trail where the data froze, hoping the environment might reveal something it had withheld. But every return felt like visiting a locked door without a key. The investigators knew Avery had been here. They just couldn't find the direction she left in. The stalemate hardened. Days turned to weeks. The once loud trail fell quiet, not with peace, but with dread. Warning signs were posted at every entrance advising caution. Morning regulars altered their schedules or abandoned the trail altogether. The park that once buzzed with life turned into a reminder. Routine could become a map for someone else's plan. With physical search efforts faltering, investigators shifted deeper into analysis. They reviewed missing persons cases from the past decade, hoping to find connections too subtle for immediate recognition. When they discovered footprints with matching initials from a disappearance years earlier, the search changed from rescue to pursuit. This was no longer about a single missing woman. It was about a pattern that had escaped detection. Offices studied Avery's last 3 weeks of activity, searching for surveillance footage not yet archived. A gas station camera caught her driving toward the trail 2 days before she vanished. A pharmacy camera recorded her purchasing athletic tape a week earlier. Her routines were preserved digitally in ways she could never have imagined. But there was one missing detail: no camera captured anyone consistently nearby. Whoever followed Avery had done so outside the range of public notice, always present but never observed. Even the most dedicated search teams eventually reach a point where the grid of possibility no longer expands but collapses inward. Investigators knew the facts. Avery had made it 1 mile down the path. She had stopped. And from that point on, nothing contradicted the theory that someone carried her away. Without more evidence, the forest would not speak. The path would not reveal its secret. Yet the silence did not imply an ending. It implied a choice. Someone had made a decision that morning, timed to perfection, executed without error. Families of missing persons often describe disappearance as a wound that refuses to close. Avery's family lived that reality daily. Every hour without an answer scraped at hope, thinning it while forcing them to hold tighter. Emma, her sister, refused to let the case settle into accepted tragedy. She called the department relentlessly, demanded updates, and pressed the community to keep Avery's name alive. A woman defined by routine now existed only in uncertainty. For the investigators, stalemate did not mean surrender. If the ground refused to provide evidence, then they would look upward, outward, backward, any direction that might give clarity. Afarav and Anifanbar, they believed the truth existed. It just needed to be forced into view. And then came the clue that shifted everything, something discovered not on the trail, but along the service road where tire marks had first sparked suspicion. Just when the case seemed determined to resist progress, the environment finally gave up a new secret. Buried in the dust beside those tire tracks, officers uncovered the rusted metal badge of a former park ranger, one whose disappearance years earlier had been dismissed as voluntary, until Avery followed a path that intersected with his fate. For most missing persons cases, time works like erosion, memories fade, urgency weakens, the community moves on. But Avery Cole's disappearance did not soften under the weight of time. Instead, it grew sharper, more unsettling. As every new detail revealed what investigators feared most, the story hadn't stopped. It had simply shifted into a place where they couldn't see it. Her absence became a presence of its own, imposing, unnerving, impossible to ignore. The discovery of the old ranger badge changed the tone of the investigation overnight. It belonged to Thomas Hale, a former ranger who vanished from the same region nearly 3 years earlier. His disappearance had been ruled a personal decision, a burnout case, someone who walked away from responsibility. Evidence had never fully supported that conclusion, but without contradictions, the label stuck. Now, with Avery's timeline intersecting his forgotten case, that narrative collapsed. 2 people, different lives, different years, gone at almost the exact distance from the trail entrance. The coincidence felt engineered. Authorities expanded the investigative radius, searching through archived materials that had once collected dust. Hale had patrolled Blackwood Ridge during the final years, before the ranger station fell into disuse. He had reported structural issues in remote areas of the trail system, old service routes no longer maintained, blind spots in cellular coverage, and abandoned ranger infrastructure hidden by regrowth. His warnings were logged, acknowledged, and filed away without urgency. Now, those neglected reports read like breadcrumbs leading back to Avery. Journalists seized the story, turning the Westwater Creek disappearance into a national obsession. News anchors spoke of a phantom figure haunting the trail. True crime enthusiasts flooded social media with theories, diagrams, timelines, and profiles of possible suspects. Conspiracy channels speculated on underground structures. Hiking communities debated organized predators in remote parks. The quiet nature walk that once represented escape from the world had become a symbol of its deepest fears. And for Avery's family, publicity was both curse and lifeline. Every headline forced them to relive the worst day of their lives. Every interview demanded strength they didn't always have, but silence was worse. It implied acceptance. Emma refused to let the case slip into cold storage. She organized weekly search vigils at the trailhead, each gathering larger than the last. Dozens of people walked the loop holding candles and wearing Avery's favorite shade of green. Strangers began calling her disappearance the perfect mile, a phrase that invaded news tickers and online threads until it no longer felt like tragedy but legend. Detectives kept returning to the same conclusion: whoever orchestrated Avery's disappearance had done this before, and likely would again. They dissected the patterns. Both victims were alone. Both reached exactly 1 mile before contact. Both vanished without leaving signs of a struggle, and both had no reason to leave their lives behind. The difference was that Avery's disappearance happened in a world more digitally connected, and yet even that connectivity couldn't prevent it. Her technology revealed a level of sophistication in the abductors' approach. They understood how to avoid being captured by devices, how to manipulate the environment, how to erase noise without erasing detail. Investigators debated motives behind closed doors. If the intent had been ransom, a message would have come. If the intent had been personal, someone in Avery's life would have surfaced with warning signs. Instead, the disappearance felt methodical, practiced, like a pattern searching for repetition. They combed through older missing persons reports in the region, marking those that shared elliptical clues, trackers that suddenly lost signal, trails with unexplained scent breaks, vehicles observed in restricted areas. A chilling hypothesis emerged. Westwater Creek might not be the only place used for vanishings executed with silence. In the months following Avery's disappearance, scattered reports accumulated of people spotting a lone figure near the same bend in the trail where she vanished. Always distant, always still, always watching. Witnesses described the figure differently depending on time of day, sometimes tall, sometimes average height, but always in dark clothing, never interacting, never acknowledging others. Each sighting ended the same way. The moment someone looked away, the figure disappeared without sound. Avery's sister refused to interpret these sightings as defeat. She believed someone was leaving reminders, proof Avery was still out there somewhere. Her hope wasn't naive. It was anchored in a fact that investigators couldn't ignore. Avery's step counter wasn't the only device to freeze exactly at 1 mile. Another case, previously closed, showed identical data patterns. And one more older record, less precise but suspiciously similar, indicated a stopwatch app that stopped just past the same distance in a nearby park. 3 disappearances, 3 frozen distances. A mile had stopped being a measurement and started being a message. The FBI deployed analysts to compare digital evidence across cases. They identified a narrow time window consistent across disappearances, early morning, low surveillance, predictable routines. The abduction zone was meticulously chosen, a place where human perception dulled and technology failed to maintain continuity. Whoever orchestrated these vanishings wasn't hiding in randomness. They were building a pattern beneath the surface of everyday life. Avery's story lingered everywhere, in news feeds, on trail signs, in the hushed conversations of neighbors who still feared morning quiet. Her disappearance had turned a safe place into a riddle, one that demanded resolution because walking away from it meant allowing the unknown to continue walking beside others. The case remained open not because evidence demanded it, but because something in the story refused to settle. The 1 mile mark became a memorial site where flowers appeared weekly, where strangers paused mid-hike and glanced into the trees, imagining the ground swallowing a life in silence. The trail no longer offered escape. It offered perspective. Routine is not protection when someone knows your script better than you do. Avery Cole's final step wasn't the end of her journey. It was the beginning of someone else's message, a warning, a signature, a move in a game only one side understood. A month into the detectives received encrypted GPS data from a hiker's smartwatch found near a closed service road. Its final step also recorded at exactly 1 mile, leading investigators to one terrifying question: how many stories had paused before anyone noticed? Avery Cole's story didn't end at the 1 mile mark. It paused. Her disappearance wasn't chaos, but a calculated interception by someone who knew her routine better than she did. Every clue suggests a silent pattern that existed long before she walked that trail. Investigators believe Avery may still be somewhere, just out of reach, just beyond the data. The perfect mile is no longer just a distance. It's a warning. Because if 1 mile can erase a person without a trace, anyone's daily routine could be the next script someone is already studying. Before you leave, think about this. How many steps have you taken today without looking back? If cases like Avery's keep happening in the quiet corners of our routine lives, then someone needs to keep asking the questions that others ignore. Stay with us as we uncover the stories that refuse to stay hidden. Because the next step could change everything,